Virtue Ethics, Part 2, Modern Efforts and Analysis. Contemporary versions of virtue ethics. Alister Macintyre is the best-known proponent of contemporary virtue ethics, though there are others who are looking at virtue ethics as an alternative to the traditional consequentialist and non-consequentialist perspectives. Alister Macintyre is a research professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. According to Macintyre, virtues are dispositions not only to act in particular ways, but also to feel in particular ways. Macintyre opines that one must create virtuous feelings or inclinations within oneself, not merely act virtuously. You can see a contrast here between Macintyre and Kant. Kant was all about duty. You do your duty regardless of your inclinations, in spite of how you feel. Macintyre says we need more than that. We need to actually have an inclination within ourselves to do the right things. We don't want people that just obey the rules out of a sense of duty. We want people who will obey the rules because they have a deep sense that the rules are right. This is how he states it. Human beings must know what they are doing when they judge and act virtuously. They should do what is virtuous because it is so. The idea is, I want to do the virtuous thing. I have a strong desire to do the virtuous thing. As a result, I have an inclination to do the virtuous thing. The theory behind all virtue ethics systems is that if I do the right thing, good consequences are going to follow, both for myself and for everyone affected by the actions that flow out of my desire to do the right thing. Well, how do you do this? How do you cultivate this emotional or heart desire to live a life of virtue? Well, Macintyre suggests that we must decide what a particularly wise and virtuous human being would do in any situation, and then do the virtuous act that such a person would do. So, you might say, well, my moral hero is John Wayne. And I ask myself in every situation, what would the Duke do if he were facing this? And then I do that thing. I imagine what John Wayne would do in that situation, and then I do that. So I might wear a little band on my wrist that says WWJWD. What would John Wayne do? To remind me that he is my moral hero. He is a particularly wise and virtuous human being. I have a good idea what he would do in various situations, and then I should follow that example. Now, that example, by the way, is not as far-fetched as it may seem. I have read that one of our former POWs in Vietnam, he was there for a long time, and he endured a brutal situation, brutal interrogations and torture, and he consciously asked himself, what would John Wayne do in this situation? And he tried to act as John Wayne would do in that situation, and it got him through. So it kind of worked for him. He was able to endure hell because he had this model of virtue that he set before himself, and he imitated that model of virtue in a very difficult situation. Now, most people would not choose John Wayne, but a lot of people have tried to follow that principle. I mentioned a little bracelet with WWJWD. I don't think anyone wears that bracelet, but maybe you've seen this one. Perhaps you've worn it yourself. WWJD. What would Jesus do? And of course, many Christians, particularly Christian young people, have looked at Jesus as the epitome of wisdom and virtue. They believe that he was the Son of God in human flesh. And so obviously, he is the perfect model for human action. And so what they would do is they would imagine, what would Jesus do if he were in this situation? And based on their understanding of what Jesus do, or their idea of what Jesus would do in various situations, they then try to do that virtuous act. And there is that strong emotional connection. There is in that Christian young person a desire to be like Jesus, and sometimes that is a very strong emotional and spiritual connection. And so they're trying to imitate the virtue of this particularly wise and virtuous human being. In doing this, you actually have a strong emotional connection with a particular wise and virtuous human being. And because of that, you really are following the example, and you want to follow the example of your moral hero. The authors offer us an analysis of virtue ethics. They point out that contemporary theories of virtue ethics are primarily a reaction against moral theories that attempt to fit our moral experience into a prior system of rules or pre-established ideas. Pre-established ideas, specifically consequentialism, that would include utilitarianism and egoethicism, Kantianism, and the authors say most especially divine command theory. Now, I'm not sure that this is completely true. The WWJD bracelets would say that virtue ethics is perfectly compatible with the divine command theory. And I don't know that Immanuel Kant would be as opposed to this idea as the authors seem to think he would be, although he did make a strong separation between the emotion and the will. And you do the right thing regardless of how you feel. And so maybe Kant would be less comfortable with this, but I can see an egoethicist selecting a model of virtue, at least as it would fit in their system, perhaps Ayn Rand or one of Ayn Rand's fictional characters like Dagny Taggart. What would Dagny Taggart do in this situation? Some woman might think, and so she might have a little bracelet on her wrist, WWDTD. So I'm not sure that virtue ethics is not an understanding of ethics that would work at least in tandem with one of these systems that we have discussed. But I think the authors are correct in pointing out that there is a reaction against these other systems on the part of many ethicists, because they look and say, you know, I don't think that ethics can fit as neatly into these systems and these philosophical concepts or constructs as the defenders of these constructs would have us to believe. And so in many ways, virtue ethics is a different approach to the moral crisis, saying maybe we do not need at this moment in history to reinvent morality. Perhaps what is needed is a refocusing on good character, as good character has traditionally been understood. And there are efforts from both the right and the left to do this. One of the efforts that's been made was by a former Secretary of Education, William Bennett. He has produced a volume called The Book of Virtues. And these contain the old stories, poems, and so forth that were used in prior ages to teach children basic, agreed upon moral values or virtues. And Bennett's point is our educational system has gone away from this, and we have focused on the development of minds rather than on the development of character. But formerly, our educational system was very much designed on the model of Aristotle or Confucius, so they didn't reference Confucius, that a person is not well educated if he has an educated mind but not an educated conscience. And so there was in former days an effort to do both, and you can see this in old things such as the McGuffey Readers. And Bennett has taken some of the best of those moral teachings from the past, put them together in a book called the Book of Virtues. It's actually a little volume if a parent would want to be teaching their children the traditional values or virtues. The authors of our textbook discuss the advantages of virtue ethics, and when they do so, they're very complimentary. They praise virtue ethics because it attempts to create good or virtuous human beings, not just robots, programmed to follow a set of moral, pre-established rules. Virtue ethics does this by attempting to unify reason and emotion. Kant separated the two. And you could look at Kant's view of things as the creation of those pre-programmed robots. You program the robot to do its duty. You have the rules that have been pre-established through the categorical imperative. And the robot then robotically follows those rules regardless of how the robot feels. And actually the robot subjugates its feelings to such a point that perhaps the robot doesn't feel at all. The strength of virtue ethics is its recognition that reason and emotion must go together when it comes to moral matters. I am unlikely to consistently do the moral thing unless I have an emotional sense that it is the right thing to do. Virtue ethics makes allowance for the lurching of that inner moral elephant. And it says that that is something that is necessary. There has to be that strong emotion that says that action is reprehensible. I will not do that. And there has to be that emotional drive that says this is the right thing to do, followed by the satisfaction after the act is done that I have done the right thing. And finally, the authors point out that virtue ethics emphasizes moderation. It's a quality that's prized by many ethicists. It's a quality that is prized by most of the world's great religions. We've talked about Buddha and his advocacy of the middle way. Paul, the apostle, wrote, "Let your moderation be known to all men." So the idea of a moderate path is something that wise individuals, both in the realm of philosophy and in the realm of religion, and in the arena of human experience, moderation has been observed to be a better path than the extremes. And the authors say this emphasis on moderation is better than an emphasis on moral absolutes or grossly relativistic principles. And they're going to talk about that more in the next chapter. The authors will surprise you a little bit in the next chapter. You might think that they're going to present a relativistic moral system. And their system does have some relativism in it. But as far as pure relativism, the authors recognize that if that is where we're headed for moral anarchy. And you remember that's one of the things the authors of our textbook fear, is that if there is no philosophical answer to the present moral crisis, we're going to see moral anarchy, which of course leads to the collapse of any civilization, or we might have people turning back to religion. And the authors have in mind there the traditional Judeo-Christian religion of the West. We will discover as we go on through the textbook that they are open to Eastern religion and Eastern philosophy. Though the authors of the textbook praise virtue ethics, they also believe that it has some disadvantages or some problems. Addressing Aristotle, they question whether human beings are teleological. Do we have an end? Do we have a purpose? If so, what is it? And how can we prove that there is such a purpose? They write, is it true or proven that all things have an end or purpose? Many people argue that they do, but many also argue that it is not clear that they do. For example, some would argue that the world and everything in it has occurred by chance or randomly, and that it is not at all clear that anything in such a universe aims toward any end except its own death or dissolution. Even if we assume that everything has an end towards which it aims, what proves that the end of human life is happiness? Couldn't it just as well be knowledge, spirituality, death, suffering, or other things? Aristotle's assumption is just that, an assumption. Now this is a good argument. They point out that Aristotle has assumed that happiness is the end towards which all human beings aspire or are aimed. And they said, can you really say that? Now Aristotle would make his argument that I look at the human race and I see human beings everywhere striving for this. No one wants to live that miserable life. Everyone seems to be wanting happiness. And I would suggest, Aristotle would say, that the ubiquity, the omnipresence of this desire for happiness, the fact that everyone seems to be aiming towards it, though not everyone is hitting the target, but the fact that everyone is aiming for happiness suggests that the end of human life is happiness. But the authors make a point. That certainly is something that human beings seem to be striving for, but is that really the purpose for which they are designed? If we accept your argument, Aristotle, that human beings are teleological, they were designed for some purpose, might that purpose be knowledge? Might it be spirituality, and so forth? And so they're saying Aristotle's assumption is just that, an assumption. But we need to point out at this time that all thought is built on an unproven assumption. The authors will acknowledge this when they present their own ethical system. They're going to acknowledge that they have certain assumptions. Assumptions are by definition something you don't set out to prove, but something you assume to be proven, upon which then you build your logical argument. So though Aristotle's assumption is just that, an assumption, logically speaking, it's no worse than any other assumption, is it? Her authors point out that there is also an epistemological problem with virtue ethics. How do we know right from wrong? People who hold to natural law theory, Aristotle, various other individuals have argued that we are born with an innate sense of right and wrong. We're pre-wired to be moral. But others have said we are blank slates and we have to learn everything, including our moral values, through experience. Now, there is a growing body of empirical evidence that suggests very strongly that we are indeed born with moral intuitions. I refer you to previous discussions of the work of Jonathan Haidt, and I would also refer you to the video we posted in this module on the Yale baby studies. Nevertheless, this has been a debate. How do we know? And the authors bring that debate into their discussion of virtue ethics, and they ask the question, do we really know that we are born with moral intuitions? Or might it just be possible that we have to learn everything from scratch? The authors also ask, what is virtue? What constitutes virtue? Now, those who hold to natural law theory or Aristotle, or even Sir David Ross would say, we know, we have an intuitive understanding of right and wrong, and it seems to be cross-cultural. Nevertheless, the authors bring up another epistemological problem. How do we know that what we consider virtue is really virtue? What we consider vice is really vice? And Rand would be shaking her head in hearty agreement at this point, because she believes that the virtue of altruism, unselfish behavior, it's considered right by most people, but Ayn Rand says it's really wrong. And she believes that selfishness is a virtue. So who's to say what is virtue and what is not? There seems to be a wide variety of opinion on this subject. We pointed out an example of this. So how can we decide, the authors say? It's really a good argument. Once you write God out of the moral equation, you are confronted with what we've referred to as the who says so problem. In the old divine rule system, when someone said, well, why is that right? You could easily answer that by saying, well, God said so. Why is this wrong? Well, God said so. But now, in a culture that is increasingly secular, who says so? Who says that selfishness is not right and selflessness is not wrong? It's a question Ayn Rand raised, and she asserted, based on the fact that human beings are selfish, that selfish is the natural state of the human creature, and that we ought to be selfish. Who says what virtue is? The authors then take on Macintyre. They talk about his idea of a virtuous human being and says, how are we to determine this or prove this? Well, I really don't think this is a problem. The virtuous human being might vary from individual to individual. One person might admire, for example, Gandhi. They may not be a religious person, and yet they would look at Gandhi and say his example of nonviolence and civil disobedience are such that he is my moral model. And so when I face a difficult dilemma, I'm going to ask myself, what would Gandhi do in this situation? And as a result of this, that the person might live a virtuous life. Another person might look, as we've talked, and say, well, Jesus is my role model. And another person might say, well, John Wayne is my role model. But chances are we are going to find that all three individuals are living very virtuous life. Here's a little experiment that I would urge you to try. Write down on a piece of paper the 5 people you admire the most. This can be someone living or dead, someone historical, someone that's just part of your own personal history. And then write why you admire them. And as you do this, you are going to be listing virtues in that person that you find admirable. Now, what we do in class is we have everyone do this, and then we compare lists. And you know what's interesting is, even though a number of different people are listed, some people list their mother, their father, an uncle, an aunt, some person from history, some religious leader. One of our Muslim students wrote Muhammad. Christian students have written down Jesus Christ. Fine. You ask why, you list the virtues, you compare the list, and you find out that people admire the same things in their heroes. And you look at that list and compare it to Aristotle's list of virtues, the mean, and you say, well, lo and behold, all of us, so we have different backgrounds, and some of us from different cultures, because I teach international students, we find out that cross-culturally we tend to admire the same qualities in those people we choose as our heroes. So it really doesn't matter if we have different moral heroes, because chances are we're going to admire the same qualities in those heroes. Now, that might not be true if you're a sociopath or if you're a psychopath. If you're Ayn Rand, you might look at some of the people that you admire, the other people admire, and you say, well, I don't like them. But I wonder what Ayn Rand's list would look like and what she would choose. It might be that once she got past her obvious preference for selfishness, that the people she has appreciated most in life are people who have modeled some of the traditional virtues. Don't know, Ayn Rand's dead. I kind of like to run this experiment with an objectivist sometime, a libertarian, and see who they list and why. I may do that. I know some libertarians. I might do a little experiment of my own here and see how consistent they are in their moral arguments. But the point I'm making here is we know virtue when we see it. We have a preference for certain behaviors, certain qualities of character. And so we come up with basically the same list of virtues when we list 5 or so of the people we admire the most. And the list also is revealing because it reveals those virtues that each of us would prefer. We come now to a key paragraph in our textbook. One of those paragraphs in which the authors let it be known exactly where they're coming from and what they hope to accomplish through the textbook they've written. They write, "Virtue ethics helps us to see that an overall theory of ethics must provide an understanding of moral character. Clearly, modern moral philosophy has failed to do this and thus is incomplete. But theories of virtue ethics are also incomplete in the opposite way, because they do not tell us what we should do in specific situations. That is, virtues do not provide specific directives for right conduct." Pause here and point out that the authors are recognizing a need for some specific ethical rules. Now, a virtue ethicist would respond, you don't get it. Rules are for people without virtue. People with virtue do not need rules. Ideally, if you had a perfectly ethical society, you would have a society without rules. Kant kind of imagined this, and he proposed a kingdom of ends, where you had people choosing, in spite of their inclination, to do the reasonable and right thing as established by his categorical imperative. You could imagine the same thing from the standpoint of all theories of virtue ethics. In a way, one of the criticisms I would bring against it is a little bit utopian. And yet at a practical level, if a society has a virtuous citizenry or a generally virtuous citizenry, you're not going to need a lot of specific guidance, because people are going to know what virtuous people do in whatever situation they happen to find themselves in. But the author's point is still well taken. Not everyone is virtuous, and you're going to have some rules. And even virtuous people are going to need some guidance, because we all face moral dilemmas from time to time. And what does the virtuous person do when they find themselves facing a situation that challenges their understanding of what virtue is? and what a virtuous person would do. I go back to the illustration I've used earlier. You're a member of the underground, you're hiding Jewish refugees in your home during the Holocaust. The SS shows up and says, "Are there Jews hiding in your home?" What would Jesus do? What would Gandhi do? Moral dilemmas happen. And so the authors make a good argument here. But here's the key paragraph. Furthermore, theories of virtue ethics do not help us analyze moral issues or effectively engage in moral reasoning. This last point is especially important because the world in which we live is becoming increasingly non-traditional. Now, you've noticed I've added a little emphasis here. The authors are rationalists in their approach to morality. They will acknowledge that there needs to be an emotional element to any moral system. And so they're going to bring that forward from virtue ethics. But they observe that the world is becoming increasingly non-traditional. And remember, traditional, non-traditional is a euphemism. It is a term for religious. When you read non-traditional, read non-religious, because traditional morality is rooted in some form of supernatural theory or divine rule theory. Now, they look at the world and they say it's becoming increasingly non-traditional. Certainly that's true in the West. Certainly the culture we're living in is becoming increasingly non-traditional. But that is not true of the world at large. My master's degree is in global studies. And interestingly, religion is on the rise and is growing exponentially in the non-Western world. Islam is growing exponentially. And though many people are not aware of it, Christianity is growing exponentially too. Not quite as fast in its increase as Islam, but it is nevertheless, you look at the growth of Christianity worldwide and you're looking at a hockey stick as far as a graph. And when you look at Islam, the hockey stick is even more sharp in its increase. The world is actually becoming increasingly traditional, while the Western world is becoming increasingly non-traditional. And the difference between the East and West is at the root of a lot of the conflict we have in the world today. If you want to understand the conflict between the Islamic world and the West, you need to understand that it is a moral conflict as much as it is a political conflict. So what the author is saying is true of the world he lives in, certainly true on the college campus, but when you look at the entire world, it's just not a factual statement. The authors continue, moreover, the world is driven by high-speed technological and social change that creates issues of increasing novelty and complexity. Well, that is true even in the majority world. The world is certainly changing technologically. When I first visited India in 1998, cell phone technology was not yet a big thing there. When I came back a couple of years ago, a couple years later, everything had changed. Everyone had a cell phone. And you go to India today, they have smartphones. Everyone has one. So things are well, not everyone. You go to some tribal areas and rural villages, not so much there. But certainly in the city, technology is changing. It is creating social change. Issues of increasing novelty and complexity, there is truth in that as well. But this does not necessarily mean that non-traditional approaches to morality are obsolete. It just means that they face new challenges. But the authors are going to continue. The ability to reason well about complicated ethical issues and to think through global moral problems and multicultural context should be a primary concern of moral education. What we need is rational moral education, not indoctrination into a specific ethical code that will enable people to learn what moral issues are and how to deal with them. Well, you can see I've added a lot of emphasis here because this is really important. The authors, again, show that they have a bias in favor of rationalism. This is pure Kohlberg. As you reach this highest level, post-conventional level of moral reasoning, you have reached the pinnacle of morality. You are thinking well about complicated ethical issues, moral problems, multicultural context. The assumption seems to be that the older systems lack the ability to do this. Well, that is, as he said about Aristotle, as the author said about Aristotle, that's just an assumption. The traditional moral systems which have stood the test of time might be able to adapt very well to the complicated ethical issues that the world is facing today. Multiculturalism is hardly new. You go back in history and you look at, for instance, the Mediterranean region and the trading that was going on and the export and import not only of goods but of ideas and theologies. And you see that multiculturalism isn't new at all. And there have always been moral issues connected to the fact that we live in a culture full of many different cultures. But the authors say we need a rational moral education, not indoctrination into a specific ethical code. And so what they are doing, we do not need traditional morality because traditional morality is indoctrination into a specific ethical code. This is a direct assault on traditionalism, which they view as indoctrination. They would put that as Kohlberg does at the conventional level and say that is all it is. We need to rise above the conventional level and become post-conventional, where we are skilled moral thinkers, reasoners. And when we do that, we will enable people to learn what the issues are and how they should deal with them. Now, interestingly, when we get to chapter 8, the authors are going to present a moral code, and they're going to say that one of the advantages of this is it can be promulgated, i.e., you can use this to indoctrinate your youth. So they are not really saying we should not indoctrinate people into specific ethical code. They are going to say we don't like the old ethical code, but we are proposing a new one, and we have no problem at all if people are indoctrinated into our particular ethical moral code, which is based on the ability to reason well on moral issues. But they're not through. They write, with such an education, hopefully they will at least know how to act virtually and ethically. To provide such an education is the main purpose of this book. Okay, there you have it. The authors are providing a new theory of moral education, a non-traditional approach to morality, and they believe it is absolutely necessary. And part of this, by the way, is because they are recognizing that we're living in a shrinking world, or as some have said, a flat world. Increasing interconnection, travel, making it possible for me to be in another culture in a matter of hours. And if globalism is going to work, if we're ever going to form a global community, the authors wisely understand that we're going to have an agreed upon basic morality, one that will enable people to deal with the complexities of living in a multicultural world that is hopefully going to be united into a new one world globalist system. Whether you believe that's a good idea or not is not the question. In intellectual circles, that's where we're moving, whether we want to go there or not. And so there is a realization that the West itself has a moral crisis. The majority of the world is still traditional, and those traditional values aren't going to play in the individualistic West. So what are we going to do? We're going to have a basic morality, a global system, something that could apply to virtually everyone in the world, if not to all people in the world. And in chapter 8, the authors, in those very words, will once again say that's what we're proposing, is a system of morals, a moral theory that will work for most, if not all, of the people in the world. So their ambition is not just to provide a new path for the industrialized West or the United States, to provide a system that will work globally. And this book is an attempt to provide the world with just such a system of moral education. End quote. This is the main purpose of this book. We're going to conclude this lecture by looking at the author's conclusions. The authors write that the advantage of virtue ethics is that it has the advantage of seeking to develop the moral person from within as well as from without. But, they write, it's based on a number of assumptions that are difficult to prove, such as human beings having a purpose and what that purpose is, that morality is innate, and what virtue, the virtues, and the virtuous human being are. Pause again here for a brief comment. When you say something is difficult to prove, you are not making an argument. You are making an observation. And as we have pointed out, the idea that morality is innate means you're born with it. There is a growing body of empirical evidence that this is indeed the case. As to what the virtues are, what a virtuous human being is, I think virtue ethics handles that fairly well, but it is an open question. It's a good debate to have. And there are certainly difficulties in proving that human beings are teleological, that they have a purpose. But there are some powerful arguments that can be made to that effect. So when you observe that some of the assumptions of virtue ethics are difficult to prove, yeah, that's true. But it doesn't in any way discredit the system itself. The authors continue by pointing out that virtue ethics do not seem any more satisfying than consequentialist or non-consequentialist theories of morality to many people. Once again, this is not really an argument, it's an observation. Counter-observation can be made. Virtue ethic theories seem more satisfying than consequentialist or non-consequentialist theories of morality to many people. Neither statement proves anything. Neither theory either proves or disproves the value of virtue ethics. They're just observations. And if someone were to offer either one of these statements as an argument, the response to that argument would be very simple. So what? The authors have concluded that their critique of virtue ethics is compelling. They have concluded that their critique of all of the ethical theories they have discussed are compelling, and that they have demonstrated that none of them is adequate given the present moral crisis. And so they ask, what are we to do? Should we retreat? Should we go back to consequentialism, egoethicism, or utilitarianism with their attendant problems? Or should we go to non-consequentialism and go back to rule, divine rule theory, or natural law theory, or virtue ethics, because they're the lesser of the two evils. They have fewer consequences than the consequentialist theories. That's an ironic thought, isn't it? Someone might say, well, yeah, maybe we ought to go revisit those things. Of course, the authors have another idea in mind. They assert there is a value in trying to synthesize the best of all of these systems while de-emphasizing the worst. And they give us a hint of where they're going to be going in Chapter 8. They're going to have some other things we're going to discuss. We're going to go away from the moral theories discussion. We're going to look at some other ethical concerns, some other philosophical concerns. But their approach as they present their own system is going to be an attempt to synthesize, to look at all these systems and take the best and discard the worst. So imagine a table full of moral systems, and they're little mechanical constructions. The authors are going to say, okay, here's the divine rule thing. We don't like very much of it. We're going to keep the stability of the system, the predictability of the system, and we're going to toss the rest of it away, and then we're going to screw in some utilitarianism and some egoethicism, and we're going to screw in a little bit of intuitionism over here, and we're going to add a little bit of virtue ethics, and we're going to, voila, we're going to have a new moral system that is actually a hybrid. It's going to be a combination of all of the systems we've looked at. It's going to be interesting to look at the author's hybrid.